You're going to be hearing about the social cost of carbon a lot more now that Joe Biden is president of the United States, because the Biden administration is going to be embedding a social cost of carbon in all of its climate policies. Now, Canada is doing the same thing, and Professor David Wright of the University of Calgary has written about it. So we're going to talk to him about it. And David, welcome to the interview.
Thanks, Marco. Great to be here.
Look, this is a fairly technical topic, so why don't you start out by giving us an overview of your blog post, please?
Sure. So more than 10 years ago, esteemed U.S. economist Frank Ackerman called the social cost of carbon the most important number you've never heard about. And one of the ways I see it is that that's changing quickly, where it's well known now by most climate law and policy and economics folks. And that's going to be increasing over the next few weeks, months, and years, because on day one of his administration or of his presidency, Joe Biden released an executive order, and one significant part of that, in Section 5, was a reconstituting of the interagency working group in the U.S. who used to lead all the work on developing, refining, and providing updates to the social cost of carbon. And so that work is sort of resumed with vigor, perhaps even more vigor than during the Obama administration years. And at the same time, probably not by coincidence, the Canadian federal government is rejuvenating its work on the social cost of carbon by committing to revising its updates and also applying it in the regulatory rulemaking realm. So a number of directions that things will go.
Now, let's talk about what is the social cost of carbon. So my understanding is that it's a cost per ton that essentially carbon dioxide emissions cost society. And I think the current calculation is around $50. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I can't put it much better. It's basically a monetary value for carbon emissions. It's usually used in cost benefit analyses to try to understand the benefits of reducing emissions or the costs of either additional emissions or carrying on with emissions. So in economist terms, this is a monetary representation of externalities, right? So no one really understands how much it costs or how much damage it causes when an additional ton of carbon dioxide is emitted. So this, using very sophisticated modeling, comes up with a number to apply to that. So it's similar, and it's actually a variation of carbon pricing, but it's used in specific contexts, primarily in regulatory rulemaking. It may be used in more spheres to come. We could chat about that.
So why is this significant? I mean, aside from the fact that now we understand both the American and Canadian governments are going to be applying it and tracking it, but why should the average Canadian or American care about that?
Well, good question. So what this means, it's basically a tool to use as a basis for decision making, particularly in making regulations. So in both Canadian and US contexts, when the government wants to put forward or put in place regulations that may reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they must, under their respective government's directives, conduct a cost-benefit analysis. That cost-benefit analysis is incomplete, it's fair to say, if there's no monetary value or representation of carbon dioxide emissions. And so where the US administration for the last 4 years used artificially low value for the social cost of carbon, that cost-benefit analysis was incomplete, if you will, because it didn't have a fair representation of the carbon dioxide emissions. So what this means is the regulatory rulemaking on both sides of the border will have a more appropriate cost-benefit analysis in place. And so you'll see regulations more, again, appropriately accounting for emissions reductions. So that could be coal-fired electricity generation, could be tailpipe emissions, and the list would go on.
So I guess then I can infer from what you just said that the reason the average person should care about it is because they're going to be paying for emissions in some way, given the plethora of climate policies that we see on both sides of the border. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it, Markham. So just to build on that, we all know that climate change will cost society. And those costs are going to be incurred whether we like it or not. And so again, using the discount rate, which is part of the modeling, it allows us to understand the price of climate change damages in the future today, and to arguably pay a fairly small price today to avoid those larger costs tomorrow. And so what may be pennies today could be significant dollars in the future.
So what other lessons are to be learned from reading your blog post, David?
Yeah, well, so this is really the U.S. reassuming its leadership role. So they are the ones, the U.S. Federal government are the ones that pioneered this, actually following a court decision back in 2008, which quite aptly said, we don't know what the right price is on carbon emissions, but we know it's not zero. So let's develop a tool that at least does the best we can. So this allows the U.S. to resume its leadership role, but to do so with, again, with vigor, so that the number can be improved, the methodologies can be improved, and potentially expanded. And so one interesting area to watch is whether or not the social cost of carbon becomes a more common part of analyses outside of regulatory rulemaking. So for example, with respect to review and approval of major projects, major natural resources projects, potentially in informing the price of carbon in the federal carbon pricing regime or provincial regimes. And we may see uptake in provincial domains, either in the form of regulatory rulemaking or perhaps review and approval of projects.
Now, given that the federal government in Canada is committed to going from, what are we at now, $40, $50 a ton, and we're going to go up to 170 by 2030, which is a significant increase in a short period of time and significantly more than the social cost of carbon, then if how important is the social cost of carbon then anyway, if the carbon tax is that high?
It's a good question, and it's a complicated one, but I'll do my best very briefly, Markham. So think of the social cost of carbon and also the current federal carbon price as just means to ends. They're just tools in the climate policy tool belt. And they're both steering towards reduced emissions, but doing so in different fashions. So on the carbon pricing side of things, so under the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, what the carbon price is doing is trying to influence behavior to achieve emission reductions. And it's generated in relation to Canada's target under the Paris Agreement. And so the economists and the government have worked together, and scientists and so on, to try to figure out, what price signal will modify behavior enough to use this tool to achieve these emission reductions in addition to the other tools, for example, direct regulation. The social cost of carbon is based on, again, the estimates of what damages carbon dioxide emissions will have or avoided, or what benefits could accrue from avoiding those emissions. And it's baked into that regulatory rulemaking. So it doesn't necessarily relate to the Canada's international climate change commitments. Rather, it relates to the damages and then comes out in the regulatory rulemaking. The reason for that dissonance is not that well explained. I've actually blogged on that a few years ago. But this is the beauty of what's flowing from the United States now, is that more research and collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, will happen that may see convergence between these two values, because at the end of the day, it is about reducing emissions to avoid impacts of climate change in the future. So that's another space to watch, and I recognize it's a bit complicated.
David, really appreciate this. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Markham.